Please welcome the panel on Rewriting the Rules of Global Conservation, moderated by Time Senior Correspondent Justin Worland.
You're not Justin Worland.
Good morning. I'm Justin Worland. I'm a Senior Correspondent at Time. Is that on now? Okay. Good morning. I'm Justin Worland. I'm a Senior Correspondent at Time where I write about climate change. Before we jump into the panel, I thought I would just get a sense of the room and see who we have here. How many people here are involved in conservation professionally or in their philanthropic interests? Good number. How many are just generally interested in the topic and coming here sort of cold? So most people are involved in some way. That's good. So right now, we're in the middle of two interlinked crises, the climate crisis, a crisis that results from our spewing of greenhouse gases into the atmosphere from industry, agriculture, transport, land use, et cetera, and a biodiversity crisis that results from human encroachment on a range of natural habitats, including forests and oceans. And the biodiversity crisis receives less attention. But at the same time, it has a huge impact not just on the species that we often hear about, but on our economy. And so we're going to dig into some of these questions, some of these interlinkages with this really excellent panel, beginning from my left, Aaron Bloomgarden, founder and CEO of Emergent, His Excellency Ivan Duque, the 33rd president, former president of the Republic of Colombia, and the author of the recent book, Nuestro Futuro. Next, we have Jennifer Morris, CEO of the Nature Conservancy, and then Wendy Schmidt, president and co-founder of the Schmidt Family Foundation and the Schmidt Ocean Institute. So I want to start really big picture. Oftentimes, as I was alluding to, the biodiversity crisis is sort of portrayed as an emotional issue, looking at species, looking at habitat loss, and that's all important, but as I was saying, really our economy, both global and local, is tied up in biodiversity. And so I want to start with a really big question. What are the stakes of the biodiversity crisis, particularly when you look at it through an economic lens? And maybe we'll start with President Duque, and we'll get some thoughts from everybody.
Well, thank you so much, Justin. It's a great honor for me to be in this panel with such a distinguished group. I think the way that we should frame the conversation is that climate and nature are not two separate silos, as many people try to put it in the frame of the global debate. I think the concept of carbon neutrality has to go hand in hand with the concept of nature-positive solutions, and primarily because there are three very complicated facts. We have lost maybe 70% of the world wildlife in the last 5 decades. And if it were a country, deforestation and negative use of land will be the second largest emitter of greenhouse gases globally. And if we also add to that observation the fact that deforestation, it's maybe the biggest challenge to the Amazon basin, and the Amazon basin can capture 10% of the world's greenhouse gases, we definitely need to put conservation in a context of immediate action, immediate funding, and innovative finance. And maybe I would add to the conversation that when we look at the commitment that we have been able to reach in conservation, there is an overall agreement of protecting at least 30% of the world's territory before 2030. We did it in Colombia in 2022. We need to get to that level before 2030, but we need to create a massive mobilization of capital with biodiversity credits, with guarantees, with a smart lending, and also bringing the private sector as a source of those deployment of capital, but putting inside the corporate behavior with the environment their contribution to effective conservation. So I will stop there in order to open the debate, but as I say, carbon neutrality needs to go hand in hand with nature-positive solution, and that requires a massive mobilization of capital.
It's great. Lots of threads in there that we'll pull on throughout this conversation. But Jennifer, I want to turn to you and just to ask sort of the same question. What's at stake here, specifically through this economic lens? And I know you do a lot of work in local communities, local economies, as well as the global picture. So maybe provide some context on that.
Sure. Thanks so much, Justin. It's great to be here with you all today. So everything is at stake. I mean, that's the bottom line. If we actually lose the projected 1 million species around the world in the next decade, which is what we're looking at, it doesn't just impact local communities, indigenous communities, it impacts all of us. It impacts businesses. In fact, we know that there was a recent study by PricewaterhouseCoopers that said that over half of the world's GDP is either directly dependent or almost directly dependent on nature. So everything that we use, whether it's access to plant material for important life-saving drugs, whether it's timber for construction, whether it's ecosystem services like water and, of course, pollinators to feed and pollinate our crops, if we lose that, we lose everything. So as President Duque so rightly said, the time is now to invest. And we're very hopeful at the Nature Conservancy. We see huge opportunities, market opportunities in the investments of both nature and climate and nature-based solutions. And let's not forget, in the climate debate, nature, the protection and the restoration of nature represents 30% of the solution to climate change. People often don't think of that. They think of it's all about technology change, and of course we need that. We need to push down our emissions as fast as possible. But if we go to net zero tomorrow, and we don't change the way that we produce food, we don't protect the most important land and oceans on this planet, then we will never achieve the ambitious goals under Paris. So nature is critical. You get not only the climate benefits from nature, but you also get the biodiversity benefits. So we're extremely excited and bullish on the investment opportunities. In fact, one of our programs at the Nature Conservancy called NatureVest has actually brought in $3 billion in private capital and invested in 17 projects with both a significant financial return that satisfies commercial investors while at the same time protecting nature. So the opportunities are there, we just have to get creative.
Great, I want to drill into that, how do we get private capital in just a minute, but I want to pull out the point you said about 30% of the solution being nature, and Aaron, come to you. You've talked a bit about how the climate moment is an opportunity to protect nature. And so what's unique about this moment and the opportunity of this moment?
Yeah, thanks very much. And it's fantastic to be part of this panel. So look, as you said, Justin, we're in a climate emergency, we're in a biodiversity emergency, and the communities that are so dependent on forests, we're also in an emergency. And so, if we look at solutions, the good news is we have the technology here, right? We have nature is an amazing sequester of carbon, right? And so 20% of global emissions are from deforestation. That's a fact that many people don't intuitively understand. They understand that forests sequester carbon, but the act of deforestation is actually an emitter of carbon. So the act of actually protecting forests reduces CO2. So we really need systemic solutions. And what we look at is carbon pricing. So pricing carbon as a solution that can help us solve not only the climate crisis, but also unlock the finance that we need. I think President Duque mentioned we need the capital. We need to deploy large-scale sources of capital to change incentives on the ground to make forests worth not necessarily more alive than dead, but we need standing ecosystems in nature. That needs a new business model, if you will, right? We need to provide those standing ecosystems with a source of revenue, and pricing carbon has the ability to do that. So we need really, as this panel suggests, we need a new model for conservation. So what we're doing is something called the LEAF Coalition, which stands for Lowering Emissions by Accelerating Forest Finance. It's a global public-private partnership that's raised over $1 billion to pay forest countries that reduce deforestation and protect their forests in a more effective way. For those of you who are familiar with REDD+, stands for Reducing Emissions from Deforestation and Forest Degradation. Our focus is on what's called jurisdictional REDD+. So meaning we look at that at a national level, right? So we just signed our first transactions with Ghana and Costa Rica. So as they protect their forests, as they reduce deforestation, they will get paid for the carbon credits that are associated with that. It's a coalition approach. So we have 4 donor countries, US, UK, Norway, and Korea. And we have 25 large companies all committing to this. And so integrity here is a key. Carbon markets have been in the news recently. We need these to work. Carbon markets are a tool. They can be used in the right way. They can also be used in the wrong way. And so we need them to be used in the right way. But if they are used in the right way, they can, in my view, unlock the billions that we need to reverse deforestation and protect nature.
So we might maybe explore some of the conversations around carbon markets and how to make them high integrity and get capital flowing that way in just a minute. But Wendy, I want to come to you just to sort of close out this sort of opening question and ask you the same question. What's at stake and what's the opportunity here? I like something that you said about the need to focus on restoration as much as conservation and the opportunity we have in this moment for that. So what are your thoughts?
Well, we're at a really interesting moment. The fact that we're having this panel at the Milken conference, tells you how top of mind this topic is becoming, not just for conservationists, but for everybody. Because when I grew up, conservation was somewhere out there in a rainforest or in some exotic island I will never go to. Actually, conservation happens right here. It happens in your own community. If you want to be a conservationist today, compost your trash. Buy your local farmers market and growers produce. These are the people helping to keep your soil biodiverse and healthy where you live. We have to change our whole attitude. Right? In the last 40 years since my husband and I were in Silicon Valley, we realized that everybody in the world is networked together. You all have a cell phone, right? You understand how important it is to be connected to yourselves and everybody you know at every moment. Well, the Earth works the same way. This isn't a special category to talk about conservation. It's something human societies have known for tens of thousands of years, and we need to relearn it. Right? The mechanisms at a large scale are terribly important, but I work in philanthropy. That's what I've been doing for almost 20 years. And I've seen a real shift. I've seen a shift in awareness, a shift in mindset. We have so many tools now to help conservation that were never available even 10 years ago. Low-cost sensors, scanners, ways to collect data, to support the cases people have been making emotionally for so long. Now we can say this is actually measurably true, and we can do something about it. To the question of scale, the role of philanthropy is to be that early risk capital. We're giving money away anyway. So when we invest in the development of technologies that can transform the way systems work, we know we're doing something that's transformational. I'll give you a quick example. I'm a sailor, and in 2012, we were launching our first research vessel, Falkor. And a young man working on it was a sailor also who held the world speed record over land in a vehicle. He had this idea for making autonomous sailing vessels called sail drones that could go around the ocean, collect data, monitor, protect, do lots of things ships can't do or that's too expensive for people and ships to do. And I remember towing his prototype out of Narragansett Bay, sending it out across the Atlantic Ocean with a little dinghy. I think we'd given him $5,000. And that little sail drone didn't make it across the Atlantic. It broke apart, something happened, it failed. A few years later, 2 sail drones were automatically sailing from San Francisco to Honolulu and back. A few years after that, 2 of them were circumnavigating Antarctica twice and going into the center in the eye of a hurricane to gather information. All of this happened with a $5,000 investment that led to $95 million in venture money in 2019 for that company. We held board seats. We helped guide them, right? They're not looking for oil and gas. That's not their exploration. They're looking to discover the world and to share that data openly with everyone in real time. That's another thing I really believe in. We can accelerate our understanding of all of these systems if we share our information. And this is our chance to do that now.
Well, that's great. A great way to open this discussion. I want to remind people that you can ask questions in the app. I think The QR code will flash on screen periodically throughout the discussion, so please ask questions. I want to drill into some of the specifics about how we actually make some of this conservation happen. President Duque, you mentioned the 30 by 30 pledge, which is something that more than 100 countries have committed to, and a lot of others are advocating for. And I'm going to ask you this very hard question, which is, how do we make that happen at a high level? You have a chapter in your book about this. How do we make this pledge to protect 30% of the world's land and oceans by 2030 happen? And we'll get more specific after that.
So I think that the way that we were able to do it in Colombia was very important because when I assumed office in 2018, we only had 13% of the country that was declared a protected area. But we had a very vibrant scientific community working on conservation, and we had defined that we needed to have a target. So the first thing we did is we committed to 30 by 30, but then we said to ourselves, if we don't do this faster, everything is just going to be declarative, it's going to be good intentions. So during 2020, the year of the pandemic, I remember that I called the Minister of Environment and I said, let's bring the whole scientific community and let's pass to 30% in 2022. So the poor minister looks at me and he says, Mr. President, how are we going to accelerate this? And I said, we need to have all the scientific community aligned. And the beautiful thing is that we brought an international coalition to support us. So TNC was there, we had the Bezos Earth Fund, we had Conservation International, WRI. We built the scientific team, and in 2022, we got to 32% of the country declared a protected area. So when the leadership is top down, things happen. And we were also aligned to the fact that we passed in Congress unanimously, in a very polarized environment, the climate action bill in Colombia. We had a climate action cabinet, so putting conservation there was essential. And Wendy, going to the maritime protected areas, we passed from 13 to 38%. And we called the president of Ecuador at the time, Guillermo Lasso, president of Costa Rica, Carlos Alvarado, president of Panama, Nito Cortizo, and we said, let's expand not only our maritime protected areas, but let's create this corridor. And we went to Glasgow in 2021 and launched, at the time, the largest maritime protected area in the planet in a shared vision of 4 countries. So you need the political will, you need to make it top down, you need to bring the scientific community, and something that was very important, to bring the smart finance. Because, for example, Bezos Earth Fund said, I'm committing, they put $300 million, and we said, we'll have another $300 million from the Colombian government. So bringing also the resources and making this an opportunity, it can be a reality. And something that is also very important, let the communities be leaders of this. So when you expand the protected areas, the payment for ecosystemical services, the payment with indigenous communities to put an end to the wrong incentives on illegal wood, illegal cattle, and instead focus on producing Amazon species and making them sustainable in an aggregated value chain, that is also very helpful. And last but not least, something that Aaron knows this very well, if you do this right, you'll be able to have carbon credits, biodiversity credits, and we were the first case in Latin America and the Caribbean, maybe in the world, of having a blue carbon bond, that we put it together and we got, for example, Apple to buy those credits in a very interesting example worldwide. So those elements, I think, are the drivers of success.
Great. Do you want to come in?
Sure, I'd love to. So I completely agree. It starts with leadership. But your point on finance couldn't be more important. So a lot of countries have signed up to what's called the High Ambition Coalition, countries that have said, we want to do 30% protection, but we just don't know how to do it. We don't have the scientific resources, we don't have the financial resources. So what a lot of organizations, including the Nature Conservancy, as well as the World Wildlife Fund and Pew Charitable Trust, we came together and we said, we want to help. We want to actually change the environmental paradigm where a lot of NGOs fight with each other. We want to say we're all about helping to achieve this global 30% goal. So instead of competing for resources, we sat down and we came up with a combined vision, and it's called Enduring Earth. And we picked those countries like Colombia, in fact, Colombia was the first one through something called Herencia Colombia to actually say, we want to do 30%, but we need your help. We're willing, as a government, to commit to these long-term protections, but we need financial and scientific resources. So this partnership's goal is to save 600 million hectares of land, about 2/3 the size of the continental United States. And we're doing it across 20 countries. I just came from the second Enduring Earth close, which was in Mongolia. So 2 weeks ago in Mongolia with the Minister of Environment, out with a herder's family, a community that has said, we want to protect our grasslands. It's the largest intact temperate grasslands on planet Earth. It's the size of the state of California. It's actually slightly bigger than the state of California. But they said, we need financial resources. So we came together with some really important donors, raised $71 million, and the government has pledged to match that funding over the next 25 years to ensure that those herding families have better grasses for their livestock and better livelihood for their families. So that's a great example where leadership at the top, followed through by really strategic resources, can make a huge difference to achieve 30 by 30.
Yeah, if I can come in, I think I just want to underscore this political leadership and finance, right? And by the way, they support each other. Finance and a flow of finance helps the political leadership, right? And so I want to congratulate President Duque for the success he's had in Colombia. But I also want to make a point that there is not enough philanthropic or government finance, capital alone to make this happen. We need to mobilize private capital, both on the investment side and also on the corporate side. That is the only way we're going to do this. And I come back to this idea of carbon pricing. Sorry to harp on this, but if we truly believe we're in a climate emergency, as I do, we're at the 11th hour, or 11:59, right? And we are basically at 1.5 degrees now, which we've said we can't cross. If we truly believe that, it should be unacceptable for 1 ton of emissions to go into the atmosphere without a price on it. So let me repeat that. Every ton should be priced every time. So where are we on that score, right? We have 20% of global emissions priced in some sort of compliance carbon market or tax. And by the way, these work, right? Here in California has reduced emissions 20% while growing its economy at 40% through the use of a cap and trade program. Success story in Europe as well. So putting a price on carbon doesn't crash an economy. In fact, it unlocks through auction revenues quite a lot of billions and billions of dollars that can be recycled and invested into more clean and green investments. Okay, so 20%, we've got great case studies. But that means we have 80% of emissions, roughly 40 gigatons of emissions, that are going to go into the atmosphere for free. How do we, on one hand, say we're in a climate emergency, and on the other hand, say, oh, it's okay, keep emitting, keep using the atmosphere as a free resource? That era needs to end, right? We've got to stop that now. I mean, we need a global movement, in my view, to call on all emissions to carry a price, right? Oh, and by the way, let me tie this back to conservation, so last point. If we do that, that can unlock more than enough capital to solve our nature issues, right? That's how we unlock not only the billions, but the trillions to protect nature, to reverse deforestation, to protect the marine conservation areas. Now, that's carbon alone. And then we can get into nature credits and biodiversity credits, which also hold promise. But those are built on the success story of carbon markets. Just last point. Sorry.
No, it's good. You're saying good things, so keep talking.
Acid rain. When I was a kid, we were really worried about acid rain. We don't hear about acid rain anymore. And that's because we used a market to address acid rain, right? So these solutions work. Sorry, thanks.
No, I was just going to ask you, okay, so this is an important point, but are you talking about a global movement to get governments to price carbon, or are you talking about getting companies to have an internal price on carbon? Can you just be more specific, and what's going to move the needle now?
So the highest and best is regulation. So where we can get it, we need a regulated price on carbon through a cap and trade program or a tax. That's the best. But we know we don't have the political will in some places, and other places just not practical, right? So where we don't have the political will or it's not practical, we need to call on companies, the private sector, and other emitters to voluntarily pay for their emissions. That sounds hard, but there is a social license to operate that companies work under, right? In order to get permitting, to comply with regulation, recruit and retain employees. So there's a lot of, let's say, political will going into getting companies to sign on to transition plans, net zero transition plans, which is important, and we need it through things like the Science-Based Target Initiative. Right? We need companies to commit to net zero by 2050. But what that also does is what they're not reducing, they're then emitting for free. Right? And we won't know if they are meeting those goals until 3, 5, 10, 20 years down the line. Right? And this, by the way, the CEO who's committed now may be a different CEO later, so they can just walk away from the goals. When we need a metric now, which says, okay, are you paying for every ton of your emissions?
Right. Well, Jennifer, I want to go back to something you said about return-seeking investment to help finance some of this conservation efforts. And I wonder if you could just talk a little bit more about how you've seen that play out and what the opportunity is there.
Is that Wendy or me?
It was you.
Oh, I'm sorry.
I think you alluded to that earlier.
Sure. So, Aaron, I agree, but I've been working on that in the US alone for 25 years, right? And I will just say that getting a price on carbon is the holy grail. We need that. Colombia has one. China has one. There are many countries, I think, 30 or so, that have a price on carbon. And we're slowly seeing that can actually work. The US, I don't want to say I've given up, but it's frustrating. So we got the IRA as a plan B. And it's doing a lot of really, really important things. I do think that the companies that have put an internal price on carbon that are actually transacting high quality, high integrity carbon credits are the leading companies. They get it. They recognize that they're not going to get to net zero tomorrow. There is going to be a time period where we can invest in nature or other types of fuel switching now and make a big difference in the world. And that's better for their supply chains, but it's also better for the planet. So then that money can go directly into conservation. That's what we're seeing. We've done almost $200 million in high quality, high integrity carbon credits that go right back in to communities. And this is something I think when we hear the controversy around carbon credits, we often think that there's, and sometimes there are bad projects. Let's not fool ourselves. There's bad projects across all companies and all spectrums. I think nature-based solutions get a bad rap, quite frankly. I saw firsthand myself, I was in Kenya last month, flying over northern Kenya, and I saw for myself the guy that was taking me around in his Super Cub was like, Jennifer, look at that school. That's a school that Carbon built. Look at that health clinic. We didn't have any doctors in this part of Kenya. Carbon credits built that. This is real money going to people on the ground and making a difference in their lives. And they have to change their conservation practices, but they get something in return that I think many of us don't realize. It is such an important, vital source of revenue for small communities around the world.
I just wanted to add something because the fact is that the amount of resources available for the global south are not there. So when you look at the debate, it has centered a lot in the global north. But let's just assume that, for example, for Africa to meet the NDCs for 2030 has to invest $2.8 trillion. And those resources are not available in the budgets, and they're not going to come from philanthropy. They need to come from the market. So if we don't understand that, we are going to literally lose an opportunity. So how do we get those resources that are available in ESG liquidity all over the world? You need to work on the supply of projects. So that's why you need to structure, you need to validate, and you need to put those projects in the eyes of investors in order to mobilize the resources. And the other thing is that in the global north, a lot of projects need to come from the global south in terms of the offsetting possibilities, because that's also a mechanism to mobilize capital. And as Jennifer well said, the issue of carbon pricing needs to be solved, because there's a big discrepancy in the price that you get in the global north on average and what you can get, for example, in Africa. And people don't think about this, but Africa, if you include negative use of land, is going to be 10% of the global emissions, which is almost the same as Europe. And if we don't mobilize the resources right now, we are going to leave a lot of the global south countries behind. And one last element, it also has to do with the smart finance for local governments, because local governments need to embrace a lot of these projects, and when they want to get big finance long term, they have to request guarantees from the national governments. But the fact that those guarantees are accounted as if were a loan for those who provide the guarantees have a negative incentive from the national governments to provide the guarantees. So if we can build a coalition of financial institutions and market players to provide those guarantees for local climate action projects, I think we'll be able to accelerate what is pending right now, and it's a massive flow of resources for the global south.
Wendy, I want to come to you just to maybe bring a philanthropic perspective to some of these questions we're talking about, and with the sort of acknowledgement that philanthropic capital is not enough, but perhaps can help catalyze some of these things. How do you see that?
That's exactly it. I mean, these discussions are about mechanisms and policies. The truth of the matter is the market doesn't have the appetite for high-risk things. You have to get to a certain point where things are proven. That's the role of philanthropy, to be able to go out and demonstrate that things work, and they work at a small scale. This is true in marine technology, it's true in agriculture, in agroecology. It's true in many, many places, but we need to take the time to do the demonstration projects to show that these things do work, and then to be able to scale them. And one of the most important areas for this is climate tech. And we have a new program inside the foundation that's looking at these mechanisms and trying to figure out how do we demonstrate that we can sequester more carbon in something we already know does it, but does it at scale, does it better. And so that's kind of the role. It is catalytic. It's also to keep bringing into the conversation the role of human rights in all of this. If we look at the global south, if we look at the development of our industrial economy, there's a lot of people left out, and they've never had a voice. And the self-determination of communities is part of the solution. If we're going to remake the economy, if we're going to work towards, say, a circular economy, where we eliminate the whole concept of waste that we're all taking for granted here, we need to be inclusive. We need to reach out to communities who haven't had a chance, who haven't had access to financing. We do a lot of work with the indigenous communities in the United States, and people have been left out, and very much on purpose in the beginning, but we have a chance to do that differently now. And there's enormous resources for us there. There's all kinds of knowledge bases that we've just forgotten. We are living the consequences of an industrial economy that we inherited. We didn't create it. All right, I'm not blaming anybody. My mother grew up in the 1930s. You could have burned whatever you wanted. You could have done anything you wanted. It wouldn't have had any effect on anything. But today we know that all of these emissions you're talking about end up in the ocean, right? When soils are contaminated, when groundwater is contaminated, it matters. You can't get it back. All the soil in the earth is not fertile. You can't grow anywhere. You could do hydroponics, I suppose, but if you really want to use soil, and it's eroding at an alarming rate, talk about conservation problems, it would take about 1 million years to recreate that soil. It's full of life, it's full of microbes, it's full of things that we're only just beginning to see and discover. This is particularly true in the ocean. Every single time we take our robotic vessel, Sebastian, into the water where there's no light, okay, beyond 100 feet. We go down to 4,500 feet. There's been about 650 dives since 2016 when this thing was launched. Every single time we see something we didn't expect to see. Every time. Discovery is the norm, not the exception. And the ocean turns out not to be a big soup. It turns out to be very biodiverse in places that people didn't know there was anything. Areas people expected to look like deserts don't look like deserts. They're rich in biodiversity and new species, organisms no one's ever seen before. We've made all of our assumptions based on an incomplete understanding. Let's be charitable about it, right? We knew how to burn fossil fuels. We knew how to power the world. We did a good job, but we're at a very different place now. And part of inclusivity and moving forward in the energy sector is to electrify, solarize everything. Let's go. There are studies now that will tell you that this idea that you have to mine the ocean for minerals is simply a miscalculation of what we could do if we could recover the minerals we've already mined. Change the mindset, redesign the system. Yes, it's going to take a lot of policy, a lot of money, but I don't think we can get where you're talking about going unless we can show people what that looks like and what that world is we want to see. Here in California, you can do that just by voting in November. We have an issue that's going to be on the ballot that is trying to overturn a law that was passed in 2022 by our bipartisan legislature, signed by the governor, endorsed by Governor Schwarzenegger, which creates a setback for oil and gas operations from homes, schools, hospitals. Seems reasonable. There's a setback in Texas. Why don't we have one in California? The health problems are so well documented. But if you go and vote to keep the law that was passed in 2022, just keep the law. You will be enhancing the health and the future health of soil, of water in the ground, of the air, ultimately of the ocean, and of millions of people in California who have been taking this burden for all of us for so long.
So many great points in there, and I want to get back maybe to how we come back in a bit to how we value some of the natural habitats, environments, biodiversity that you were alluding to, I think, very powerfully. I did want to just talk a little bit more about some of the finance elements of conservation, particularly in emerging economies. And, you know, there was I'd be curious to just delve into a little bit the question of sovereign debt, which is an issue where there's been a lot of experimentation, a lot of different models about how we might reduce sovereign debt to create space to invest in conservation. I know this is something that Colombia has quite a history in, and so President Duque, I might start with you and might get some thoughts from Jennifer as well.
So when you look about the role that governments need to create in order to be followed by the markets, I think there was a very nice example when we launched at the New York Stock Exchange the green taxonomy of Colombia. So many of you will ask, okay, what do you mean by a green taxonomy? So we literally got every single policy, every single investment, every single action in a transparent way for the markets to see what was going on in terms of climate action in Colombia. So the launching of that green taxonomy had an impact in smart finance, at least in 2 or 3 products. I'll mention the first one. We decided, after we launched the taxonomy, to come out with 2 green bonds from Colombia. So the buyers of those bonds could see not only the policies, but the indicators that will deliver on each one of those points. And you know what we got? We got 7%, and we call it greenium, which was a premium for those who were buying those bonds. So right information that is traceable, that is trustworthy, that is scrutable, allows you to move along that line. The second thing was that we created the possibility to launch guarantees for long-term financing and local governments. And we also allowed the government and the private sector to put together products like the blue carbon bonds that were issued after the project of the Cispatá Bay in the northern coast of Colombia. We had the supply, we brought the demand, and the international philanthropic scientific community helped us to get that recognition. But the other element that is there is how can you connect all this with the development of voluntary carbon credit markets? Because, you know, carbon credits sometimes receive a lot of heat in the debates, but as maybe Winston Churchill mentioned when it came to democracy, if we didn't have the carbon credits, we'll have to create them because it's a massive element to mobilize capital. And we started putting the issue of integrity, we started putting the issue of right accounting in order to build those products. And that's why Colombia, maybe after Brazil, was in South America the most vibrant market for this kind of solutions. So I would say that if all these elements are together, we will be able to think much better. But let me just make a small mention of the Amazon. We can do everything right in terms of climate action in the Western Hemisphere, but if we don't stop deforestation before the next 5 years, we will not achieve the NDCs from Canada to La Patagonia in Argentina. And the reason is as simple as this. The Amazon captures every year almost 10% of all the greenhouse gases that are emitted globally. And the Amazon has lost in the last 4 decades, due to deforestation, the size of Texas and California together, or France and Germany, how you want to put it. And if in the next 5 years deforestation doesn't come to zero, the Amazon will no longer be a contention wall and will become a net emitter of greenhouse gases, and that will be a tragedy. So why do I connect this with the smart finance? I think we are at a stage where the political commitment to stop deforestation, it's there. We've seen good results in Brazil, Colombia, maybe in Peru. Guyana is zero deforestation. But if we put that effort of getting to zero deforestation with smart financing, with the taxonomies, with the products, and connect this with aggregated value chains with indigenous communities, I think that will take us to achieve, at least in terms of nature-positive solution, the most efficient, effective, and important element for nature-positive results hemispherically.
Absolutely. Well, I don't know if you want to come in.
Sure, yeah, I'd be happy to. So completely 100% violent agreement. And just want to recognize your opening, Justin, on the fact that a lot of the countries that we work with in the Global South, they have 3 challenges. Many, many others, but 3 big ones to talk about today. Number 1, of course, is the biodiversity crisis, climate crisis, and the debt crisis. So about 60% of lower-income countries are either close to debt default or in debt default. They as communities cannot actually invest in helping farmers to become more resilient to climate change, helping coastal communities to protect their mangroves, build seawalls, all the things that they need to do for the future that is not just coming, but is here for many of the countries we work in, because they're paying so much of their GDP to international creditors. So back in 2016, the Nature Conservancy worked with the government of the Seychelles, who wanted to protect 30% of its marine ecosystem, but said, we have this crippling debt. Can you help us? So we did. We went in and we worked with some other institutions and were able to refinance their debt, issue a new transaction that ended up enabling them to have the savings to protect the 30% of their marine ecosystems. We said, okay, well, that was kind of interesting. Let's try to replicate this. We've now done in 4 countries $1.2 billion in debt conversion using really critical, and this goes back to your guarantee, essential underwriting from the US Government Development Finance Corporation, as well as in one transaction in Barbados, a guarantee from the Inter-American Development Bank to refinance these countries' sovereign debts. Belize, for example, was on the brink of default. We stopped that from happening, refinanced 11% of their total sovereign debt, and unlocked total across those countries $400 million in financing from the private sector. There was some initial philanthropy that was critical, as Wendy said, to get this thing started. Every single transaction costs about $2 million. But we've been able to unlock $400 million in money from pension funds, from long-term investors who want to see a nature impact backed by an organization like the Nature Conservancy to actually yield real money for 30% marine protection. We don't want to just be the only one to do this. And now Pew Charitable Trust just did a transaction last year in Ecuador that was $1 billion for marine ecosystem in Ecuador. Ecuador is getting ready to do another one where you have countries lining up who want to work on these transactions. And we want every environmental organization out there to take this on, because this is a real solution thanks to those underwriters, and quite frankly, thanks to some pretty innovative bankers. You know, Credit Suisse at the time was our transaction partner on this, and they looked at us like, are you crazy? This is so complicated. How are we going to do this? After we did the first one, they said, we can't wait to do more. And the staff in these institutions love this because often they're working on transactions that don't, quite frankly, have the innovation or the environmental impact and social impact of these deals. So we've got banks also lining up saying, can we do one now as well? We want to be in this game. So it's a real solution that we think has to now evolve into transforming the entire financial space when it comes to lending to sovereign nations. Because these deals are great, but ultimately we need the World Banks, the IMFs, all the big lenders on the planet to actually look at a different way of doing business to make sure that countries are supported when they have major climatic impacts or pandemic shocks, because they simply cannot afford to pay back the same amount of debt that they have historically while also protecting their people from climate change.
That's great. Thank you for that, bringing that to life. I want to weave in an audience question following up on something that President Duque said about the Amazon being on the brink of this very vital tipping point, which would have really catastrophic effects across the globe. And the question here is, how would you like to see natural capital valued in financial markets? And so I think about the value of protecting the Amazon on the brink of that tipping point, and the value seems quite high. Excuse me. It seems quite high. How do you actually get that value incorporated into financial markets? And that's for anybody, but if you want to start.
No, I think that's maybe the big question, and is how do you define the value? Because obviously when you talk about carbon neutrality, you already have at least a clear element of value, which is the ton of carbon. When you're talking about protecting the rainforest, the situation becomes a little bit more complex. But still, I think we have to solve something, and is that in traditional carbon credit projects, existing jungle could not be part of those projects. I mean, you could use maybe avoiding deforestation or things like that, but it's clear that those projects are not eligible. But let me give you an example. Guyana, 85% of the territory is tropical forest, almost zero deforestation. And could Guyana mobilize capital for keeping that areas protected? I think they should. And I think that's why we need to define a value of linked or connected to the carbon that you're storing and you're protecting, but also giving a value of that biodiversity. And the same thing needs to occur in the rest of the Amazon countries. This year, there was a very interesting report that came out in the World Economic Forum on biodiversity credits. So if you ask me, what do I think is going to be the next smart element of financing for nature, will be biodiversity credits, in which we define a value of the total area of protection, a value of the species that are protected, a value to the participation of local indigenous communities, and that should be the way to make these superpowers of biodiversity big attractors of smart financing. But that also takes me to an issue in terms of corporate ESG. As companies buy offsets and they also do their own carbon reduction, I think there should be a part of the portfolio of ESG devoted of protecting areas of those places that are critical for the protection of the planet, which will include the Amazon basin, the Congo basin, the South Asia basin, and also maritime protected areas. That level of capital from the private sector to those needed investments are critical, and today we have seen companies that have experienced those kinds of commitments. That's what we need today.
If I could weigh in also. First, in terms of carbon pricing, in terms of traditional public-private and capital markets, right? I think carbon pricing is probably the largest market that most investors haven't heard of, right? It's approaching $1 trillion market. S&P has a global carbon index. Full disclosure, I helped create it. There's an ETF on the New York Stock Exchange that tracks the global price on carbon. I spent a lot of time talking to large multi-billion-dollar asset owners and asset managers who really are not thinking about climate at all in terms of taking a climate filter to their portfolio. So first, we need them to do that. I think climate change is the way in. I think carbon markets are the way in. Second point I'd make is I think existing carbon markets are, there's a structural challenge that we have, which is they have moved towards this idea of removals, right? really focused on technology as a solution, and to the detriment then, I think, of nature, right? And so I think we need to shift existing carbon markets, and I think Jennifer made this point, I think we need to shift existing carbon markets to value nature in a more robust way. We can talk more about that, but we don't have time. Then nature and biodiversity. I think there's a lot of promise in nature and biodiversity credits. In fact, the US, another market that most investors haven't heard of, mitigation banking markets, right? The US has had biodiversity banking markets for the last 20 years. They're fairly significant size. And I think we need to bring those to the South, the global South. The challenge, of course, with biodiversity and nature markets is oftentimes they're very local, right? Both the impacts and the supply is very local. But I think we need to use the example of carbon markets and bring nature and biodiversity into traditional markets.
That's an important point. Okay, yes.
Just really quickly, so I completely agree with all of this. However, when it comes to the Amazon, we can't wait to actually have a price on carbon to save the Amazon. Right. So the biggest threat to the Amazon, does everybody know? Cows, right? Cattle ranching and soy to feed cows. So we have leadership, thankfully, in one of the states in Brazil, in the state of Pará, Governor Helder, who's basically said, I want 100% of the 24 million cows in his state to have full transparency. So you know where they're born and whether there was deforestation, where they were born, all the way to, on average, 6 different farms before they either are shipped overseas live to China and Vietnam or slaughtered to stay in Brazil. The biggest market, 85%, stays in Brazil. So I want to know where those cows have been and exactly if there's been deforestation in the supply chain. That may seem like an easy thing. You're used to seeing ear tags on cows. Brazil has never done this. And they have the largest global herd by far of any nation, including the United States. We have to have full transparency so we can link deforestation to cows and stop it before it continues. Because if we lose any more in the next 5 years, as President Duque said, it's going to be just very hard for us as a human society to deal with the consequences because the Amazon is such an important biome. So yes, price on carbon, but let's start focusing on cattle transparency and stopping deforestation now.
That's great. Okay, so I want to switch gears a little bit. The engagement with indigenous communities has come up quite a bit, so I want to put a finer point on it. Wendy, go to you. I know that you've done a lot of work helping support indigenous communities in this conservation conversation. What can we learn in a broad sense from indigenous communities to help protect conservation? How does that filter in or factor into your efforts here?
I think the learnings that we have gathered from indigenous communities is that they don't even see it the same way. Right? Some of the work we do has to do with repatriation of lands to tribal communities. In their world, you don't own land. You occupy it and you steward it. In today's market economy, we have to buy it back, which seems a little unfair, but there you are. There's a notion of stewardship and relationship that I think we need to learn from. If you thought of every living creature as your relative, whether they're the finned or the winged or the four-legged or the two-legged, you might think about what you're doing a little bit differently. Again, we have evolved in a culture in the United States, largely derived from European societies, and we've grown up in this mindset. It's very extraction-based. It's exploitative, fundamentally. And a Native community would never see the world that way. It would be a reciprocal relationship. And I think if we're going to survive into the future, regardless of the effects of climate change, hopefully we will adapt to these, but we're going to have to question our relationship with the resources of the world and imagine a more regenerative and reciprocal relationship with those things. If everyone in the world lived the way Americans do, Annie Leonard will tell you, you would need 4 Earths already. So that's not viable. Okay, the question of waste, as I said earlier, was built into our economy. And it is affecting people in the global south and in countries that have the least ability to deal with it. It's all over the bottom of the ocean in a way we can't even clean it up. The microfibers are in the air, they're in our bloodstreams. I mean, this is the industrial process we are talking about. And it doesn't need to be preserved, it needs to be reimagined. There's an enormous task in front of us for investors to reimagine industry, to reimagine bio-based solutions to products that came out of the old industrial economy. I think that's the exciting opportunity. And yes, time is short, and we are losing species on this planet at such an alarming rate, but we all want to be part of the solution, I think. People don't want to be part of the problem. We happen to live in that system. But it really comes to visionaries and institutions, governments and leaders to rewrite that story for humanity going forward. And to do that, maybe we have to look back quite a bit to societies that survived for so long without any of this.
It's a very powerful point. I guess I'd be curious just to talk very briefly a bit more about Indigenous engagement, participation in some of these projects, and Jennifer, turn to you because that is an important piece of some of these projects. You know, how does that play out? How do you make sure it happens at a project level in an effective way?
So local communities, Indigenous people, they're the stewards of the land and the sea, as Wendy said, and you can't do anything long-term with success without not only having, we don't call them stakeholders, we call them shareholders. So they have to be at the table. They have to be developing the change in management plans for their communities together with any whether it's a municipal government, a national government, or an organization that's trying to help them. So have to be at the center of the decision-making process, or quite frankly, I mean, conservation just won't ever work. People have to have the local incentives. They have to know that there's going to be a job available for them if they stop some extractive activity. People don't want to be cutting down the rainforest or hunting, but they don't have a choice if they have no other option. So it's absolutely essential for everything that certainly the Nature Conservancy, but many other organizations do, is that Indigenous communities are part and parcel. And I'll just say one more thing. You know, I have a good friend, Hindu Ibrahim, who is an Indigenous leader, who says, you know, you allow us to steward 80% of the world's biodiversity, but you won't give us any money directly for it. And she makes a pretty powerful point, which is that there needs to be more financing going to the Global South and northern organizations that represent Indigenous people. And we need to trust that if they can steward this land and sea appropriately, they can actually manage financial resources too. We've got to do a lot better job at that as a global community.
That's great.
I do a lot of work, and Jennifer knows this, in the Amazon. And just to put it as an example, in the Amazon, we have to fight illegal cattle, illegal wood, illegal mining, and illegal crops. They are the drivers of deforestation. But the indigenous communities require also carrot and stick to fight those crimes. In most of the Amazonic countries, just to give an example, most of environmental crimes do not have imprisonment sentence. So they literally create all these mobs of criminals that start blackmailing or putting pressure or even doing a lot of aggressions to the indigenous communities. So we need to solve part of the law and order piece in order for them to be more active in the way they involve in the protection. But then you have to win with them the possibility of them trusting in the payment for ecosystemical services, and also to become forest guards. And something in which the private sector can support a lot is if we disincentivize the use of illegal wood or illegal cattle, and we start buying some Amazonic products like copo azul, sancha inchi, camu camu, that are, or black pepper, or the palms from the Amazon, and be able to bring in a sustainable, scalable, and replicable way those products to markets such as the US, that will generate a permanent sustainable income with those indigenous communities. But last and not least is that you need to give them the right titles for the land that they're going to care. And I think, for example, Guyana has made a beautiful case in which 14% of the country has been controlled by the indigenous communities with due land titles. So land titling connected with ecosystemical services and having the law and order conditions so that they're not exposed to violence are critical so that they effectively become a substantial part of the solution.
That's great. I'm going to do something risky. We have 90 seconds left. There was an audience question about a lot of the roadblocks, Article 6, this really difficult international mechanism that's been debated, SBTI, the Science-Based Target Initiatives, where there's been a whole bunch of blowback. These are all speed bumps. What is one bright spot that is keeping you, if not optimistic, but hopeful in some way about the future of conservation? In one sentence, and we'll just go down the line.
I thought you were going to raise Article 6 with 90 seconds left. That was going to be a lot of fun. Well, let me just say, public-private partnerships and platforms and models that we can scale. When we have political leadership like President Duque, we, as an international community, investors, philanthropies, we need to pile in and support that.
Great.
I will mention one thing, and I've seen it, for example, in Capitol Hill. When you talk about conservation, you feel a bipartisan spirit. So I think the word conservation is not affected in most of the countries by political polarization, and I think that is an asset for having smarter regulation and smarter products with fair pricing.
Great, okay.
Nature bonds, private capital going into conservation directly.
Data science for the environment. That's going to change our world.
Excellent.
Great.
Well, what a great discussion. Please give a hand to the panelists.
Thank you.
Learned a lot. Thank you.